You're in the water loop.
Waterloop is a nonprofit media outlet made possible in part by a grant from Springpoint Partners. Visit waterloop.org. This is episode number 150, Voices for the Voiceless. Many of the 1 million people in California who lack access to safe and reliable drinking water are Latino agricultural workers living in small communities throughout the state's Central Valley. Despite agriculture's reliance on them as a workforce, the industry uses vast quantities of water and often pollutes resources. Change is difficult because these people are on the absolute bottom of the political pyramid and lack a voice in government, as discussed in this episode with Janaki Anagha, Director of Community Advocacy at the Community Water Center. Janaki talks about the need to focus on changing representation in local water boards and how her organization is helping to identify, train, and support people as candidates for political office. The conversation will begin in 1 minute, but first, a word about our sponsor, Varuna. Waterloop. This episode of Waterloop is sponsored by Varuna. Water systems are facing more requirements and challenges than ever before and have to stay aware and adapt in real time. Enter Varuna. The dynamic web-based tool helps water utilities to stay resilient by identifying more than 24 risks that are both internal and external. These include all the typical risks that systems have to deal with, and also a variety of newer factors, such as climate change and environmental justice. Not only does Varuna track risks, but it makes recommendations on actions to take, and then changes status in response to measures the utility takes. And because public engagement is so important, Varuna provides information that can be shared with others, including customers. With Varuna, better data means better decisions. Learn more at varuna.city and let them know you heard about it on Waterloop.
You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop. Joined for this episode by Janaki Anagha. She is Director of Community Advocacy for the Community Water Center out in California. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Travis.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. When I hear about and think about the number of people, the lives in this country that are impacted by not having clean, reliable water, it's just upsetting. And in California's Central Valley is one of the places where this problem is most acute. We're going to talk about some solutions for sure, but could you talk a little bit about the water situation there in the Central Valley? What's going on? Who's impacted?
And I'm sure right now you and your listeners are starting to hear more about drought impacts in California as we're well into the summer and deep into one of the worst droughts, again, that we've ever had in history. And we continue to hear that, right, over and over. This is the worst drought in history. This is the worst drought in history. And there's this notion in climate sociology called shifting baseline syndrome, where, for instance, like children who aren't familiar with the polar bear may at some point in the future be like, oh, a world without polar bears is normal because this is the world that I grew up in, right? And so for those people who are experiencing climate impacts every year, it's like that year becomes their next baseline. And we continue to re-normalize the extreme temperatures we're facing, and we continue to normalize the drop in our groundwater levels. And that's something that, we're working against all the time. And we're glad to have journalism properly cover the drought. But in many cases, it's not as nuanced of a narrative as we need to have. And to answer your question around what are some of the existing impacts for folks in California, I mean, the reality is that over 1 million people in the state of California don't have access to clean and affordable drinking water. And that's been a reality for decades on decades, despite the fact that we have really robust federal and state legislation to support enforcement around contamination and more recently around quantity. But the ongoing historical setup of California's infrastructure is what makes California this epicenter for drought impacts in a way that other states don't experience. And that's because of the history of agriculture in the state of California being one of our biggest ag states, and the fact that our water infrastructure has never been planned for the humans who live in the cracks and crevices of our agricultural industry. Agriculture was kind of what settled California, from the dawn of the colonial project to today in 2022. Agriculture has been a primary driver for state planning. And when it comes to water, that's certainly the same thing, that we have farm worker communities who are the communities that you'll hear about when you start hearing about drought impacts. These are the places where folks turn on their taps and no water comes out, or the water that comes out is contaminated by agricultural chemicals or fertilizers or pesticide byproducts. Folks in San Francisco and San Diego and Los Angeles probably not going to feel those impacts. And you won't hear about those people on NPR. What you're going to hear about are the residents who live in the tiny communities that we work with at Community Water Center. These are places like the community of Porterville, a little tiny town in Tulare County. Tulare County is one of our most agriculturally productive counties by dollar acre value. However, in terms of the human development in that area, extremely challenged, very economically depressed, and educational attainment is very low, linguistic isolation is really high. And in those places, that's where we've got this mismatch of where agricultural water is headed, and it's not going into people's homes. That's our communities are mainly drawing their domestic water from groundwater.
Yeah, you talked about the cracks that and the crevices, and it's striking to me that you have this mighty agricultural empire, right? It is a huge economic machine, big business, a lot of money involved, but it's on the backs of these people that work out in these communities, but then they're not being taken care of, despite the fact that they're the ones that make this whole agricultural machine work. Just curious in your reaction on that, and how the people that are higher up in the agricultural machine are not attentive or concerned or doing anything about this.
Yeah. Our California kind of political pyramid is at the very top of it. We have our governor and our Congress people, and within the Congress, we have typically a large number of folks that come from industrial agriculture who represent some of these small communities that are populated primarily by farm workers. And as we go down the rung, we have county boards of supervisors, and then we also have our public utility districts and the community service districts. And this is where the local decisions are made around water and who has access to domestic drinking water. And again, a lot of these are populated by folks who have a historic tie to agriculture. There's sort of a revolving door there, right, between those people who have historic landholding or whose families were involved in large agriculture. And then at the bottom, the base of our pyramid, which is where we work at Community Water Center, is our farm worker community and the folks who live and breathe the realities of extractive industry. These are people who are both in agriculture, as well as people who are in the oil industry, people who are in packing and processing of agricultural products. And these are all, primarily at this point, immigrant communities. I mean, this is the history of California, right? I mean, for a lot of the folks who live in these places, not much has changed since The Grapes of Wrath being written. And The Grapes of Wrath is a great document of the immigrant history of California and this really incredible rainbow of different communities that have put their sweat into the development of this state. And for many of those residents, they don't have access to the ballot box due to their immigration status or simply a serious disenfranchisement that a lot of these communities face due to their geographic location. And also just a sort of lack of participation in civic life, which is a byproduct of being somebody who has been ignored by the system at large. So that pyramid that I'm talking about is something that we at Community Water Center are trying to shift. Hopefully one day, and that's not going to be within my lifetime, but hopefully within a few of my lifetimes, to flip that thing upside down so that we start to see representation for the majority of the people who live in these communities rather than just the few who are the landed minority.
I know that one of the things you all are doing is actually trying to work on that issue, address that lack of representation in government and in decision-making positions. And so could you talk a little bit about that effort to create that change? The idea of, I think, supporting candidates, finding, identifying, supporting candidates for local offices and trying to get them in there, people that will, prioritize water solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and our focus is on that local level that you're talking about for a reason. That to us, that's where some of the most powerful and most immediate decisions can be made that can change the trajectory of the future of one of these little communities. And I'll just give a little bit of kind of general background about how water is managed, domestic water is managed,
Sure.
and specifically groundwater, because the folks that we work with at Community Water Center are groundwater users. We don't really do a whole lot in relation to agricultural irrigation water, which is managed by the federal government, and there's the state and federal water projects, which are these huge arteries that move through the state carrying thousands of acre feet of water to surface water purchasers who are the farmers. The folks that we work with are domestic groundwater users, maybe people who we're talking about communities that are maybe like 600, 700, 1,200 people that started out maybe as a tent settlement or started out as just a group of migrants who showed up to an area and dug their own well by hand. And now that well is contaminated with modern day fertilizers and pesticides. These are our environmental justice hotspots in California. These are our historic settlements that rely on groundwater. And sometimes, like I'm saying, these is either a collection of wells, could be maybe 2 or 5 wells that are supporting this settlement, or it could be a smattering of individual homes that all have their own domestic well. And it's in these places that there's an opportunity to shift the way those resources are managed at the local level. Because under California law, once you have a certain amount of connections, if you have over 25 connections to a well, that system becomes regulated. So there's a leverage there for the state under the Safe Drinking Water Act to ensure that that well, it doesn't exceed certain chemical levels, what are called maximum contaminant levels, which are the levels that are set such that once those are exceeded, there's a documented detriment to human health. So that framework allows us to ensure that the decision making around that water is pertinent to the local community, because once you have that public water system, there has to be a governance system for that water, right? So those are usually little utility districts, like I was mentioning before, public utility districts, or the community service district is another name for that governing body that is going to make those decisions around treatment, operation, and maintenance of those treatment facilities, and the rates around that water. So for us, we want to see residents from the community take a step into being the folks that are on those often 5-person boards of community service districts, public utility districts, because the historic trend is that it's typically not people that are super responsive, typically not people who are trained, and certainly don't have the progressive viewpoint around being in that elected office, where they take building trust with the local community seriously and advancing, innovative projects, or utilizing state funds to ensure that water is clean and that there's transparency around decision making. So we also have a sister organization called Community Water Center Action Fund, which is our C4 entity, and we do engage in things like candidate endorsement, supporting residents to learn about what it takes to be in that elected office, and then helping them through every step of everything from enrolling to participate in the election, to doing canvassing and phone banking, and supporting them with all of the steps to get to being on there. And sometimes in these little communities, it can be a margin of like 5 or 15 votes that will send somebody into office. And it's because these are such small communities.
Sure. That's an awesome effort. How is it going? This is more of like a recent effort, a really kind of recent push to do this? And yeah, where's it stand? How's it going?
Yeah, so our C4 entity has been around for about 2.5 years now.
Okay.
And prior to that, we have always worked with community progressive residents who want to step into that elected office. And we have a leadership cohort called the Community Water Leaders Network, which is taking the individuals who have come out of the environmental justice movement, who've been in this work with us, who've been showing up to rallies at the Capitol, passing some of our most important water protection legislation, folks that come to monthly meetings, and those people who have sort of show an interest to take this next step into being an elected office, and carrying with them these progressive politics. So in some ways, it's sort of a boot camp for these progressive water elected leaders. And that's a phenomenal resource, because what we see from that is just being in this elected office in the midst of so much structural racism, a changing climate, increasingly fatal summers, and just against the current, so to speak, of extreme water contamination and the financial challenges of trying to fix that in such a small tax base. What I'm outlining here is just a really grim job, and not a lot of people do it. It's just a thankless role to take. And so
a big uphill battle, right? I mean, it's just a long way to go to get these problems addressed.
Yeah. So what we try to do is create a sense of community there and make sure people know that they're not alone. Because even the fact that it takes, for a lot of these little communities, it's going to take an hour to get to your local grocery store. It's going to take an hour to get to your doctor's appointment. Do you think that these people are going to find time to befriend people in other communities nearby that are suffering these similar situations? They often don't. People feel alone, and they're geographically isolated, and their issues tend to feel that way too. So we try to bridge as much of that as we can, and celebrate successes as much as we can.
Well, you said something that caught my attention, and you said you don't know that in your lifetime, that you're going to see a big tidal change in this, and that it's going to take a lot longer. You have to have some hope to be doing this work, right? So talk to me about that, because I mean, you're pushing uphill too. This is a big push. So you gotta have some hope. You gotta see something here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I carry hope with me every single day. And in some ways, that's my job as being somebody in a nonprofit organization where a lot of what we do is organizing. And me personally, my organizing school of thought is derived directly from my mentor, Gustavo Aguirre, who was a part of the United Farm Workers movement. And so I've derived a lot of the way that I go about organizing from the UFW and Cesar Chavez's form of engaging communities in collective action. And if I can't cultivate the hope in myself, how can I have any capacity to cultivate hope in another person, right? So I have my own practice to build my own hope. In Spanish, we use the word ganas to like have this, it's the gumption to move forward and to take action. And so for me, what gives me hope, especially around issues of drinking water, is to see that like who actually occupies the base, you know, and that, like I'm saying, in some of these communities, it can be a margin of 5 or to 15 votes that can flip the future of one of these communities. And though we are up against hundreds of years of colonial politics and big agriculture dominating the conversation around how water is managed, the demographic transition's happening quick, you know, and in a short order, we can really, you know, utilizing the legal frameworks we have available to us and the organizing skills that, you know, I know that we can cultivate, putting people into these elected positions can have dramatic effects on the decisions that are made to access the infrastructure needed for safe and affordable drinking water. And that's the hope right there, is that it takes the political will to access water and to make appropriate decisions around sustainability and conservation, and ultimately reconnect the residents who live in these places. You know, it's not people that look like us who caused the problem, you know, and like we have the ability to carry our own traditions around ways of farming, knowledge around water management, and bring those into the decision-making spaces that we create for ourselves. And that to me is the future. And we're on our path to get there. Whether or not we will outpace the reality of climate change is not something that I try to bring into my frame of mind, because that it's too much for me. Like, I don't think I can do both at the same time. So I do engage in a bit of cognitive dissonance in order to.
Yeah. Well, you know, it seems that over the past several years across this country, there's been a real movement from the grassroots, if you will, of people realizing that they can rise up and take power and create change. And some of what you're saying kind of definitely gets at that. And it's certainly needed that you said it only once, but I should say it again, 1 million people, right, in California that lack safe, reliable water. That is not known by the public, and it really should be. It's an outrage. Thank you for the work you're doing, and I look forward to keeping in touch and keeping track of the good work out there.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being on.
Waterloop.
Thank you for listening to the podcast, and thank you to this episode's sponsor, Varuna. Please check them out at varuna.city and let them know you heard about it on Waterloop. To find all of our episodes, sign up for email updates, and connect on social media, visit waterloop.org.
Waterloop.